The noise was a physical thing, a living beast that slammed against Arthur Hale's ribs with every beat of the subwoofers. It was a cacophony of sound, light, and scent, and he hated every particle of it. Lasers, sharp and predatory, sliced through the artificial smoke, painting fleeting, garish patterns on the writhing mass of bodies that packed the dance floor. The air was thick, almost suffocating, a cloying cocktail of expensive perfume, spilled liquor, and the raw, musky tang of alpha and omega pheromones clashing in the dark. For an omega who spent his days in the quiet, sterile logic of a server room, this was a special kind of hell. "Come on, Arthur. Live a little." Maya, his co-worker from marketing, shouted over the din, her voice a high-pitched trumpet in the symphony of chaos. She grabbed his hand, her grip surprisingly strong, and tried to pull him deeper into the throng. He resisted, planting his feet like a stubborn mule. "I think I'm living a little too much," he yelled back, the words feeling foreign and rough in his throat. "My version of living involves a functioning firewall and zero risk of tinnitus." Maya just laughed, a bright, carefree sound that was swallowed by the music. She and the rest of their team from the IT department's social committee had practically dragged him here. It was a team-building exercise, they'd claimed. A chance to unwind. For Arthur, it was an exercise in overstimulation. He was a creature of order, of clean lines of code and predictable outcomes. This place, the Gilded Cage, was the antithesis of his entire existence. Every corner held a new variable, a potential system crash. He extricated his hand from Maya's grasp with a polite but firm tug and retreated towards the relative safety of the bar, a long, glowing slab of polished obsidian. He ordered a club soda he didn't want, just to have something to hold, a prop to make him look less like a lost child. Leaning against the cool surface, he scanned the crowd, his analytical mind sorting the people into categories as a defense mechanism. The preening alphas, puffing out their chests and scenting the air with arrogant confidence. The giggling omegas, basking in the attention, their movements fluid and inviting. It was a primal, theatrical display, and it made him feel profoundly lonely. That's when he saw him. He wasn't in the center of the crowd, but on its periphery, occupying a shadowed booth as if it were a throne. He was an alpha, that much was clear from the sheer force of his presence, an invisible gravity that seemed to bend the room around him. He wore a designer suit, tailored so perfectly it looked like a second skin, the dark fabric a stark contrast to the riot of color in the club. Tattoos, intricate and dark, crept up from his collar, hinting at a world far removed from corporate team-building events. But it was his face that held Arthur captive. Sharp, aristocratic features, a jaw that could cut glass, and a predator's smile that was all cynical amusement and zero warmth. He held a glass of amber liquid, swirling it slowly, his eyes scanning the room with a look of bored ownership. As if sensing Arthur's gaze, those eyes, a startling, intense gold, flicked over and locked onto his. The connection was instantaneous and electric, a jolt that bypassed all of Arthur's carefully constructed defenses. The alpha's smile widened slightly, a silent challenge. Arthur's instinct was to look away, to break the connection and fade back into the background where he belonged. But he couldn't. He was pinned, a moth caught in a searchlight. With a languid grace that was both menacing and captivating, the man rose from his booth and began to move through the crowd. People parted for him, a subconscious recognition of the power he radiated. He moved directly toward Arthur, his golden eyes never leaving his face. "You look like you'd rather be debugging a legacy system than be here," the alpha said when he reached the bar, his voice a low, smooth baritone that cut through the club's noise with unnerving ease. It was a voice that didn't need to shout to be heard. Arthur stiffened, his social awkwardness warring with a sudden, unfamiliar surge of defiance. "And you look like you own the place," he retorted, his tone sharper than he'd intended. The alpha's smile grew, a genuine crack in the cold facade. "Close. I own the building." He leaned an elbow on the bar, his proximity sending a wave of heat and a scent like sandalwood and ozone over Arthur. It was intoxicating, and it set every nerve in his body on high alert. Ryan Cross. Arthur Hale. Arthur, Ryan repeated, tasting the name. Too proper for a night like this. You should be in a library, surrounded by dusty books, not in a cage with animals like us. And you're too full of yourself to fit in a library, Arthur shot back, shocked at his own audacity. This was Ryan Cross. The name echoed in his mind, plucked from the hushed, fearful gossip he sometimes overheard at work. The Cross family. The city's underworld royalty. This man wasn't just dangerous, he was a walking, talking system failure waiting to happen. Ryan threw his head back and laughed, a real, unguarded sound this time. It was a beautiful, terrifying sound. I like you, Arthur Hale. You have a spine. Just then, the music shifted. The frantic, pounding rhythm bled away, replaced by a slow, heavy beat with a sensual, grinding bass line. The lights dimmed to a bruised purple and deep crimson. The air, already thick, became heavy, charged with a new kind of energy. It was a hunter's song. Dance with me, Ryan said. It wasn't a question. I don't dance, Arthur replied automatically, his heart hammering against his ribs. You do tonight. Before Arthur could protest further, Ryan's hand was on the small of his back, a firm, possessive pressure that guided him away from the safety of the bar and onto the dance floor. His touch was electric, burning through the thin fabric of Arthur's shirt. They didn't move much, just swayed to the rhythm in the center of the swirling bodies. But the tension was unbearable. Ryan's alpha pheromones were a deliberate, targeted assault on his senses. Arthur felt his own omega instincts, long suppressed and ignored, rising to the surface, a traitorous tide of submission and desire. He could feel the heat of Ryan's body, the solid muscle beneath the expensive suit, the ghost of his breath against his temple. You're trembling, Ryan murmured into his ear, his voice a velvet rumble. This is a lot, Arthur managed to say, his voice barely a whisper. Is it? Ryan pulled back just enough to look at him, his golden eyes dark with an intensity that stripped Arthur bare. Or is it exactly what you've been missing? In that moment, under the suffocating lights and the hypnotic beat, Arthur knew he was right. He had spent his life building walls, creating order from chaos, denying the fundamental, instinctual part of his nature. And this man, this dangerous, magnetic alpha, was tearing it all down with a single look. The part of him that craved control was screaming in protest, but a deeper, more primal part of him sighed in relief. He gave in. The fear didn't vanish, but it was consumed by a wave of intoxicating, reckless need. He leaned into Ryan's embrace, letting the last of his resistance crumble. The rest of the night was a blur of sensation, the taste of whiskey on Ryan's lips, the feeling of his strong hands in his hair, the overwhelming, possessive scent of an alpha claiming his omega. It was emotional, raw, a desperate collision of two worlds that should never have touched. It was a beautiful, catastrophic era. When Arthur woke, the sun was streaming through the window of an unfamiliar, opulent hotel room. The bed was cold, the room empty, and the scent of alpha still in the air. The logic of code was a sanctuary. In the clean, predictable world of Python scripts and cascading style sheets, there was no room for the messy, chaotic variables of human emotion. For 2 months, Arthur Hale took refuge there, burying himself in the cool, blue glow of his monitors. He worked late, arrived early, and volunteered for the most tedious, mind-numbing projects, anything to keep his thoughts occupied and his memories at bay. He was over-analyzing lines of code, searching for phantom bugs, all in a desperate attempt to distract his mind from the one catastrophic error he couldn't debug, the night he had spent with Ryan Cross. He tried to forget. He told himself it was a momentary lapse in judgment, a perfect storm of stress, exhaustion, and a few too many drinks he wasn't used to. A statistical anomaly in the otherwise orderly data set of his life. But memories were not lines of code, they couldn't be commented out or deleted. They were insidious, ghosting at the edges of his consciousness, waiting for a moment of weakness to strike. A whiff of expensive cologne from a passing stranger in the street would send a jolt through his system, his mind instantly conjuring the scent of sandalwood and ozone. The low, confident rumble of a client's voice on a conference call would make the hairs on his arms stand up, echoing the baritone that had dismantled his defenses. He would catch his reflection in the polished elevator doors and see a different person looking back, someone with a new, unsettling depth in his eyes, a shadow of the person who had surrendered so completely to a dangerous stranger. His carefully curated peace was fragile, and the outside world seemed intent on shattering it. The city was on edge, a low hum of anxiety running beneath its surface. The gossip in the office break room, once centered on deadlines and departmental rivalries, was now dominated by hushed, fearful conversations about the escalating violence in the criminal underworld. "Did you hear about the shootout in the warehouse district?" Maya whispered one afternoon, her voice laced with a morbid excitement as she leaned over Arthur's cubicle wall. "They're saying it was the Moetti family making a move on cross territory. 3 men dead." Arthur's fingers froze over his keyboard. "The Cross family at it again," another co-worker, Leo, chimed in, scrolling through a news site on his phone. "That Ryan Cross is ruthless. They say he's consolidating power, cleaning house. The man's more ghost than gangster, no one ever sees him coming." Arthur felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He tried to tune them out, to focus on the syntax glowing on his screen, but the name echoed in his head. Ryan Cross. Not just an alpha in a nightclub, but a king in a kingdom of shadows and blood. The memory of their night together, already tinged with regret, now felt coated in something far more terrifying. He had willingly, eagerly, danced with the devil. The thought made him feel sick. He closed his eyes, took a deep, shuddering breath, and forced himself to type. Focus on the code. The code is safe. That night, he stayed at the office even later than usual, using a complex server migration as an excuse to delay his return to his empty, silent apartment. When he finally logged off, the building was deserted, and the city outside had draped itself in the deep, inky black of a moonless night. The walk to his apartment was usually a short, familiar journey, but tonight it felt different. The familiar streets seemed longer, the shadows deeper and more menacing. Every stray sound, the distant wail of a siren, the clatter of a garbage can lid, made him jump. He had the distinct, prickling sensation of being watched. He picked up his pace, his keys clutched in his hand like a makeshift weapon. He told himself he was being paranoid, that the office gossip had seeped into his subconscious. But the feeling persisted, a cold weight on the back of his neck. He glanced over his shoulder, but the street was empty, save for a few parked cars gleaming under the orange glow of the streetlights. That he was just a block from his apartment building when a black car, sleek and silent as a panther, turned the corner and pulled up alongside him. It moved without sound, its engine a low, predatory purr. Arthur's heart leaped into his throat. He broke into a run, but he didn't get more than 3 steps. The car's back doors flew open and 2 large men in dark suits emerged with a terrifying, professional swiftness. Before he could even shout for help, one had grabbed his arms, pinning them behind his back, while the other held a cloth over his mouth and nose. The smell was chemical and sweet, and his lungs burned. He struggled, kicking and twisting, but their grip was like iron. His vision began to swim, the edges blurring into a dark tunnel. The world dissolved into a kaleidoscope of streetlights and rising panic. Through the fog of his fading consciousness, he heard one of the men speak into a device on his wrist, his voice calm and detached. "We have the package." A tinny voice replied from the device. As his mind went dark, Arthur clung to the last words he heard, a phrase that would seal his fate. "The boss wants him alive." Then, everything went dark. Consciousness returned not as a gentle dawn, but as a violent system reboot. Arthur's first sensation was a dull, throbbing ache at the back of his skull. His second was the bewildering softness beneath him. He was lying on a bed, but it was unlike any he had ever known. The sheets were silk, cool and impossibly smooth against his skin, and the mattress seemed to cradle his body with an almost liquid support. A faint, clean scent of lavender and expensive linen filled the air. For a moment, he allowed the comfort to lull him, his mind still fuzzy and disconnected from the violent chaos of his last waking moments. The black car, the iron grip, the sickly sweet cloth. His eyes flew open. He wasn't in his own small, cluttered apartment. He was in a vast, palatial bedroom that looked like it had been lifted from the pages of an architectural magazine. The ceiling soared high above him, adorned with intricate plasterwork. The walls were a deep, calming charcoal gray, hung with abstract art that probably cost more than his entire annual salary. A wall of floor-to-ceiling windows was concealed behind heavy, velvet curtains, blocking out any indication of time or place. Panic, cold and sharp, sliced through the fog in his head. He threw the silk duvet off and scrambled out of bed, his bare feet sinking into a plush, cream-colored rug. He was still in his work clothes from the previous day, though his shoes were gone. He rushed to the windows and tore back a section of the heavy curtain. He was met with a view of a meticulously manicured garden, sprawling lawns, and a high, unscalable stone wall that bordered the property. It was daytime, but the sky was a flat, indifferent gray. He turned his attention to the only door, a massive, imposing slab of dark wood. His heart hammered against his ribs as he ran to it and twisted the heavy, ornate handle. It was locked. He rattled it, then banged his fists against the unyielding wood, the sound swallowed by the sheer size of the room. "Hello," he shouted, his voice sounding small and thin. "Let me out of here. Is anyone there?" Silence was his only answer. He pressed his ear against the door, listening. Faintly, he heard the subtle shuffle of movement from the other side. They were there. Watching. Waiting. He was a prisoner. A wave of pure, unadulterated fury washed over him, eclipsing the fear. How dare they? How dare anyone treat him like this, like an object to be packaged and delivered? His mind, the analytical tool he relied on for everything, began to race, desperately trying to process the variables. He was kidnapped. The last words he heard were, "The boss wants him alive." Who was the boss? The name that had been haunting the city's whispers came to his mind, a cold premonition that settled in his gut. It couldn't be. He spent what felt like hours pacing the length of the opulent cage, his mind a whirlwind of terror and rage. He catalogued every detail of the room, searching for a weakness, a potential escape route, but found none. The windows were sealed shut, the glass likely reinforced. There was no phone, no computer, no link to the outside world he understood. There was only luxury and silence. Finally, just as his anger was beginning to fray into a raw, helpless despair, he heard the distinct, metallic click of a key turning in the lock. He spun around, his body tensing, fists clenched at his sides as the heavy door swung inward with a soft, expensive sigh. And there he was. Ryan Cross stood framed in the doorway, a king surveying his domain. He was dressed in a simple black cashmere sweater and tailored trousers, a vision of casual, understated power. He was even more formidable in the clear light of day than he had been in the shadows of the nightclub. His golden eyes, sharp and intelligent, swept over Arthur, taking in his disheveled state with an unreadable expression. He was the picture of calm authority, a stark, infuriating contrast to the maelstrom of emotion raging inside Arthur. "Good. You're awake," Ryan said, his voice the same smooth, low baritone that had haunted Arthur's dreams. He stepped into the room, and two large, impassive guards in dark suits moved to flank the doorway behind him, their presence a silent, brutal declaration of control. "You," Arthur breathed, the single word a cocktail of shock, betrayal, and white-hot rage. The premonition had been correct. It was you. "I see your deductive reasoning skills are still sharp," Ryan said, a faint, mocking smile playing on his lips. He walked further into the room, his movements fluid and confident. "I was beginning to worry the chloroform had dulled them." "You cowardly bastard," Arthur spat, taking a step forward, his body trembling with adrenaline. "You drug me and have your thugs drag me off the street in the middle of the night? What happened to the big, bad alpha who wasn't afraid of anything?" Ryan's smile didn't falter, but a dangerous glint entered his eyes. "I'm not afraid of anything, Arthur. Least of all you. This was simply the most efficient method of acquisition." "Acquisition?" Arthur's voice rose, incredulous. "I'm not a company you can buy. I'm a person. You can't just take me." "I can," Ryan stated simply, his tone leaving no room for argument. He stopped a few feet away, the air between them crackling with a thick, volatile tension. "And I did. I had to find you. I don't do unfinished business. The sheer arrogance of the statement, the way he framed their night together as some sort of transaction he needed to close, sent a fresh wave of fury through Arthur. Unfinished business, he repeated, his laugh sharp and humorless. We had a one-night stand. It's the definition of finished. I am not your business, Ryan. Everything in my city is my business, Ryan countered, his voice dropping to a low, possessive growl. He took a step closer, invading Arthur's personal space. The scent of him, sandalwood and ozone, filled Arthur's senses, and his traitorous body responded with a shiver that was equal parts fear and a remembered thrill. And you, Ryan continued, his golden eyes boring into him, have been my business since the moment I saw you. They stood inches apart, a standoff of wills. Arthur could feel the heat radiating from Ryan's body, could see the pulse beating in the strong column of his throat. The raw, primal part of him that had responded so fiercely in the nightclub was stirring again, a deep, resonant hum beneath his rage. He hated him for it. He hated himself for it. So, what's the plan? Arthur challenged, lifting his chin in defiance. Keep me locked in this museum until you get bored? Am I your new pet Omega? Ryan's gaze darkened. In a flash, his hand came up and cupped the back of Arthur's neck, his fingers firm, his thumb stroking the sensitive skin just below his ear. The touch was electric, sending a shockwave through Arthur's entire system. His breath hitched. Don't tempt me, Ryan murmured, his face so close now that Arthur could feel his breath on his lips. For a heart-stopping second, he thought Ryan was going to kiss him. He could see the conflict in those golden eyes, the cold control warring with a darker, more volatile hunger. The memory of that mouth on his, of that passion, surged through him, and he despised the weakness, the longing, that flared in its wake. He stood his ground, refusing to flinch, refusing to give him the satisfaction of submission. The moment stretched, thick with unspoken things. Then, as quickly as he had moved, Ryan released him and stepped back, his mask of cool indifference sliding back into place. The loss of contact left Arthur's skin tingling and cold. Get some rest, Ryan said, his tone dismissive as he turned to leave. We have things to discuss when you're less hysterical. He walked toward the door, every line of his body radiating absolute control. He had won this round, ending the confrontation on his terms, leaving Arthur feeling raw and off balance. But as he reached the doorway, Arthur saw it. It was a small, almost imperceptible thing. Ryan paused, and his free hand moved instinctively to press against his stomach, a brief, fleeting gesture. A flicker of pain, a deep-seated weariness, crossed his face for just a fraction of a second before it was gone, replaced by the same cold mask. The guards closed the door behind him, and the lock clicked shut, plunging the room back into silence. Arthur stood frozen, his mind reeling. The encounter had left him shaking with a toxic mix of rage and a deeply unwanted physical arousal. But beneath it all, a new variable had been introduced into the equation. That wince. That momentary, unguarded flash of vulnerability. It didn't fit. It didn't make any sense. And for an Omega who built his life on logic, the inconsistency was almost as terrifying as the gilded cage he was trapped in. The heavy door clicked shut behind him, the sound of the lock a final, punctuating note to a confrontation that had left him dangerously exposed. Ryan Cross did not stride down the marble hallway, he moved with a rigid, controlled fury, his composure a paper-thin veneer over a chasm of chaos. The two guards fell into step behind him, their presence a familiar, grounding weight, but today it was not enough. Every calculated word, every dismissive gesture in that room with Arthur had been a performance, a desperate reinforcement of a mask that was beginning to crack. He had felt the Omega's eyes on him as he turned to leave. He'd felt that sharp, analytical gaze catch the flicker of weakness he had failed to suppress. The brief, involuntary spasm of pain in his abdomen, the hand that had moved to soothe it, it was a catastrophic slip in a high-stakes game. In his world, you didn't show pain. You didn't show weakness. You didn't show anything but absolute, unbreachable strength. To do otherwise was to paint a target on your own back. He dismissed his guards with a curt nod at the entrance to his private wing and retreated into the sanctuary of his office. The room was his fortress, a testament to his power. A desk of polished mahogany the size of a small car sat before a panoramic window overlooking the city, a sprawling kingdom of glittering lights that bowed to his will. The walls were lined with books he'd never read and artifacts he'd acquired, symbols of a dominance that felt, for the first time in his life, terrifyingly fragile. He walked to the bar, his hand reaching for a crystal decanter of aged scotch. He poured 2 fingers, the amber liquid catching the low light, but as he raised the glass, a wave of nausea, acrid and overwhelming, rose in his throat. He set the glass down with a clatter, his hand trembling slightly. This was the latest symptom in a string of unsettling biological betrayals. The fatigue that settled deep in his bones, the strange sensitivity to smells, the intermittent, cramping pains that his body had no reason to be experiencing. He had attributed it to stress. The Moetti family was getting bolder, and there was a rat in his organization. Stress was a constant companion. But this felt different. This was visceral, internal. It was a rebellion from within his own cells. He strode to his desk and pressed a concealed button. A silent, encrypted line connected. "Get Dr. Thorne. I want him at the clinic in 30 minutes. Full lockdown. No one in or out." He didn't wait for a reply before severing the connection. The Cross family's private clinic was a sterile, state-of-the-art facility hidden in the sub-basement of one of his commercial high-rises, accessible only by a private elevator that required his biometric scan. It was a place for patching up gunshot wounds and treating ailments that couldn't be recorded in public records. It was a place for secrets. Dr. Alistair Thorne was already waiting when Ryan arrived. He was a small, balding man in his late 60s with nervous, intelligent eyes behind thick glasses. He had been the Cross family doctor for 40 years, had treated Ryan's father, and had seen more blood and desperation than any battlefield surgeon. He was also the only man on earth Ryan trusted with his physical vulnerabilities. "Ryan," the doctor said, his voice hushed with professional concern. "What's happened?" "Your message was urgent." "Alistair," Ryan acknowledged, stripping off his sweater and sitting on the edge of the examination table. "I want a full workup. Blood panel, ultrasound, everything. Now." The doctor blinked, surprised. "An ultrasound? Is there internal bleeding? Did you take a hit?" "No," Ryan said, his voice flat and cold. "Just do it." For the next hour, the only sounds in the room were the quiet hum of medical equipment and the doctor's occasional, gentle instructions. Ryan lay on the table, staring at the white acoustic tiles of the ceiling, his mind a fortress of forced calm. He was an alpha, the pinnacle of their genetic hierarchy. His body was a finely tuned weapon, built for strength, aggression, and dominance. Whatever this was, it was an anomaly, a malfunction that Alistair would identify and fix. The doctor's silence grew heavier as he studied the results of the blood test on his monitor, his brow furrowed in a deep, troubled line. He then moved the ultrasound transducer over Ryan's abdomen, his eyes fixed on the grayscale image flickering to life on the screen. A strange, rhythmic pulsing filled the room. A heartbeat. But it wasn't his. Dr. Thorne went pale. He slowly wiped the gel from Ryan's skin, his movements stiff, his face a mask of disbelief and something that looked terrifyingly like fear. "What is it?" Ryan demanded, sitting up. The doctor's reaction sent a shard of ice through his gut. "Alistair, what did you find?" Dr. Thorne swallowed hard, taking off his glasses to polish them with a trembling hand, a nervous tic Ryan hadn't seen in years. "Ryan, what I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible. I'm not in the mood for riddles." The doctor took a deep breath. "The blood work shows hormonal levels that are unprecedented. HCG, progesterone, estrogen, all exponentially elevated. And the ultrasound, it confirms it. There's a gestational sac. A fetal pole. A heartbeat." He looked up, his eyes meeting Ryan's, filled with a terrible, clinical certainty. "You're pregnant." The word hung in the sterile air, an absurdity, a violation of every known law of nature and biology. Ryan stared at him, a cold, silent laugh building in his chest. It was a joke. A mistake. "That's not funny, Alistair." "I'm not joking," the doctor whispered. The laugh died in Ryan's throat, replaced by a surge of pure, violent rage. He was off the table in a flash, his hand grabbing the front of the doctor's white coat, slamming him back against the wall of medical cabinets. Trays and instruments clattered to the floor. "Don't lie to me," Ryan snarled, his face inches from the terrified doctor's. "I'm an alpha. This isn't possible. It shouldn't be." Dr. Thorne choked out, his face losing all color. "But it is. I've read about it, case studies, theoretical papers. It's a 1 in a billion genetic mutation. A dormant recessive gene that, when combined with a potent omega and a massive hormonal surge, can activate latent uterine tissue. Your body, it's functioning as both alpha and receptive carrier." Ryan's grip slackened. He stepped back, his mind reeling, trying to process the clinical jargon that was describing the utter destruction of his reality. A mutation. A biological freak show. His rage imploded, collapsing into a cold, black vacuum of fear. Weakness. In his world, weakness was a death sentence. An alpha who couldn't control his own subordinates was deposed. An alpha who showed pain was tested. But an alpha who was pregnant? He would be a laughingstock. A target. An abomination to be torn apart by his rivals, his allies, even his own men. His entire empire, built on a foundation of fear and untouchable strength, would crumble to dust overnight. He thought of Arthur. That defiant, intelligent Omega. It was him. It had to be him. The night that had been a reckless, intoxicating indulgence had become the genesis of his potential ruin. He turned back to the doctor, his eyes cold as ice. His voice was a low, menacing whisper. "This conversation never happened. These records will be erased. You will not speak of this to another living soul. If a single word of this gets out, I will personally ensure that the last thing you see is the inside of a furnace. Do you understand me, Alistair?" The doctor, still shaking, could only nod, his eyes wide with terror. "Good," Ryan said, his composure rebuilt, forged in the fires of pure, abject fear. He pulled on his sweater, the familiar weight doing nothing to soothe the hollowness inside him. He had to take control. He pulled out his phone and dialed his head of security. "Marco. Double my personal detail, effective immediately. And I want round-the-clock surveillance on a new asset. His name is Arthur Hale. I'm sending you his file. He is not to be harmed. He is not to be contacted. But I want to know every time he breathes. Treat it as a top-tier security threat." He hung up and walked out of the clinic, leaving the terrified doctor in his wake. Back in the solitude of his office, the city lights seemed to mock him, a glittering testament to all he stood to lose. He stood before the window, his reflection a ghostly superimposition over his kingdom. His hand moved, slowly, hesitantly, to his abdomen. There was no outward sign, nothing but the flat, hard muscle he had always known. But beneath the surface, a secret was growing. A weakness. A ticking bomb. His mind flashed back again, unbidden, to Arthur. To the sharp intelligence in his grey eyes, the surprising defiance in his voice, the way he'd felt, soft and warm and yielding, in his arms. It hadn't just been about power or possession. There had been something else, something softer, a flicker of a connection that he had enjoyed far more than he would ever admit. A longing stirred beneath his pride, a complicated, dangerous emotion. He was the king of this city, a man who bent the world to his will. But now, he was a prisoner of his own biology, a walking contradiction that threatened to destroy everything he had built. He pressed his hand against his stomach, a gesture of both dread and a strange, terrifying ownership. "He can't ever know," he whispered to the empty room, the words a vow made to the ghost in the glass. For 3 days, Arthur was a ghost in a gilded cage. He was left entirely alone in the palatial bedroom, a prisoner of silence and luxury. Meals appeared on a silver cart outside his door at precise intervals, the food exquisite, the presentation flawless. He ate mechanically, his mind elsewhere, plotting. He had mapped every inch of his prison, studied the patterns of the guards he could sometimes hear in the hallway, and analyzed the view from his window. The estate was a fortress, surrounded by sprawling, open lawns that offered no cover, all enclosed by a formidable stone wall. Escape would be next to impossible, but the alternative, passively accepting his fate as Ryan Cross's possession was unthinkable. His rage had cooled from a white-hot inferno to a hard, cold knot of determination in his gut. He was an IT specialist, a problem solver. This was just the most complex system he had ever needed to crack. On the fourth day, he found a potential vulnerability. The staff who delivered his food were professional and silent, but they were human. They followed a routine. He waited, his heart a steady, determined drum against his ribs. When he heard the soft rattle of the food cart approaching, he moved to the far side of the room, feigning sleep on a chaise lounge near the window. The door unlocked, and a young man in a crisp uniform pushed the cart just inside, his eyes carefully averted. This was his chance. Arthur exploded into motion. He launched himself at the door, a blur of desperate energy, shoving the surprised staff member and the cart aside. He was in the hallway, a long, opulent corridor of marble and dark wood. Freedom was a tangible thing, a heady rush of adrenaline. He ran, his bare feet slapping against the cold, polished floor, ignoring the shouts of surprise behind him. He didn't know the layout of the mansion, but he followed the simple logic of any building. Find the stairs, get to the ground floor, find a door to the outside. He skidded around a corner and found a grand, sweeping staircase that descended into a cavernous foyer. He could see it, massive front doors, his gateway out. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his lungs burning, his mind screaming at him to move faster. He was halfway down when 2 of Ryan's guards appeared at the bottom, materializing as if from the shadows. They were huge, impassive men who moved with a terrifying economy of motion. They didn't run, they simply positioned themselves to intercept him. He was caught. The fight went out of him, replaced by the bitter, metallic taste of defeat. He slowed to a stop on the staircase, breathing heavily, as the guards ascended to meet him. They flanked him, their presence overwhelming, and one simply said, "This way, sir." There was no aggression in his voice, just the calm, unshakable certainty of a man who was used to being obeyed. They didn't take him back to his room. Instead, they escorted him through another part of the mansion, through rooms filled with priceless art and antique furniture, until they reached a pair of tall oak doors. They opened them and gestured for him to enter. It was Ryan's office. The Alpha was standing by the massive window, his back to the door, looking out at the city. He didn't turn as Arthur was ushered into the room. The doors closed with a soft, final click, leaving them alone. The silence stretched, thick with tension. Arthur's defiance began to bubble up again, hot and sharp. "Enjoy your morning jog?" Ryan asked, his voice a low, dangerous purr. He still hadn't turned around. "I was just stretching my legs," Arthur retorted, his voice tight. "The accommodations are lovely, but the service is a little clingy." Ryan finally turned, and the cold fury in his golden eyes made Arthur's breath catch. He had seen him angry before, but this was different. This was the controlled, lethal rage of a predator whose prey had dared to challenge its dominance. "Do you have any idea the position you are in, Arthur?" he said, walking slowly toward him. "You are a guest in my home. A very privileged guest. But you are also an asset. And assets that try to run away get put on a shorter leash." Arthur bristled at the word. "I'm not your asset. I'm not your property. And I am not your pet." He took a step forward, closing the distance between them, his own anger overriding his fear. "You think you own everyone you touch?" A muscle tightened in Ryan's jaw. He stopped directly in front of Arthur, their chests almost touching. The difference in their size and presence was stark. Ryan was a mountain of solid, controlled power, and Arthur was a willow, trembling but refusing to break. "No," Ryan said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a raw, possessive edge to it. "But I take responsibility for what's mine." The arrogance of that statement snapped the last of Arthur's control. "What's yours?" he scoffed, his voice rising. "Because you cornered me in a nightclub? Because you decided you wanted something and took it? That's not responsibility, Ryan, that's conquest. That's what a tyrant does. You don't care about people. You only care about power." "You know nothing about me," Ryan snarled, his composure finally cracking. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I know you're a coward." Arthur shot back, his words sharp as daggers. You hide in your fortress and send your thugs to do your dirty work. You couldn't even face me after that night. You just vanished. Is that how the great Ryan Cross handles his responsibilities? By running away when things get too real. You think this is me running away? Ryan's laugh was a harsh, bitter sound. He gestured around the opulent office. This is me taking control of a situation. This is me protecting my interests. There you go again. Interests. Assets. Business. Arthur was shouting now, years of repressed frustration and a lifetime of being underestimated pouring out of him. I'm a person. With a life. A life you've completely destroyed. If you're so in control, so powerful, then why did you have to kidnap me? Why couldn't you just face me? What are you so afraid of? He jabbed a finger at Ryan's chest, the contact sending a jolt through both of them. What is it that has you so terrified that you have to lock me away? Tell me. He saw it then. A flicker. A tremor that ran through Ryan's powerful frame. It was almost imperceptible, the kind of micro-expression he was trained to spot in lines of code, an error in the system. Ryan's iron control was wavering. His gaze was intense, burning, but beneath the anger, there was a deep, dark well of something else. Something that looked like fear. The realization gave Arthur a strange, reckless courage. He lowered his voice, his words now a deliberate, surgical strike. Then why are you trembling? The question hit its mark. Ryan flinched as if struck. The anger in his eyes was instantly eclipsed by a flash of raw, unfiltered panic. He took a half-step back, breaking their intense proximity. The color seemed to drain from his face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly, shockingly weary beneath the harsh office lights. I'm not, he said, but his voice was strained, the denial paper-thin. He turned away abruptly, a clear retreat, moving back toward the safety of his desk. As he did, Arthur saw it again, the same gesture from the bedroom. A hand pressed almost unconsciously to his stomach, a wince of pain that he tried to hide, but it was too late. The mask had slipped, and Arthur had seen the cracks beneath. Ryan stood with his back to him, his shoulders rigid, fighting for a composure that was already lost. Get out, he said, his voice a low, rough command. Go back to your room. The guards opened the door without being summoned. Arthur didn't move for a moment, his mind racing, trying to connect the dots. The kidnapping, the possessiveness, the strange mix of fury and fear. And now this, the trembling, the pain, the profound, bone-deep exhaustion he could suddenly see radiating from the Alpha. Ryan Cross, the ruthless king of the underworld, was hiding something. A secret. A weakness. And for some reason, that weakness was intrinsically tied to Arthur himself. His anger hadn't vanished, but it was now tempered by a new, unsettling emotion, a deep, burgeoning suspicion. His distrust was no longer just about his captivity, it was shifting, evolving into a reluctant, unnerving concern. He walked out of the office, the guards closing the doors behind him, leaving the king alone with his shadows. As he was escorted back to his room, Arthur whispered the question to the silent, opulent hallway, his voice barely audible. What are you hiding from me, Ryan? The confrontation in the office left an indelible mark on the silence of Arthur's captivity. The question, what are you hiding from me, Ryan? Was no longer a whisper in the hallway but a roaring in his own mind. He replayed the scene endlessly, his analytical brain dissecting every micro-expression, every tremor, every crack in the Alpha's iron facade. The possessiveness was a cage, but the fear in Ryan's eyes had been a cage of a different kind, one he was trapped inside. For 2 more days, Arthur waited. He was a model prisoner, quiet and compliant, but his mind was anything but still. He was gathering data. He noted the precise timing of the guards' patrol shifts, the faint electronic beep of the security pads near the doors, the way the house fell into a deep, profound stillness in the hours just before dawn. He was no longer just planning an escape, he was planning an infiltration. He needed information, and the heart of the system, the central server of this entire operation, was Ryan's office. The opportunity came on the 3rd night. A storm rolled in over the city, a wild, chaotic thing of lashing rain and distant thunder. The wind howled around the corners of the mansion, creating a symphony of noise that could cover a multitude of sins. It was perfect. He had spent hours painstakingly working on the lock of his bedroom door with the metal clip from a pen left on his food tray. It was a simple lock, designed more for privacy than for security, and his delicate, precise fingers finally managed to trip the mechanism. The soft click was lost in a peal of thunder. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic counterrhythm to the storm outside. Slipping out into the darkened corridor, he was a ghost in the machine. He moved with a practiced quietness, his bare feet making no sound on the thick runners that carpeted the marble floors. The security system was sophisticated, he was sure, but it was designed to keep people out, not in. He gambled on the assumption that the internal motion sensors would be deactivated to allow the staff and guards to move freely. He navigated the labyrinthine hallways from memory, the path to the office now seared into his brain. He reached the heavy oak doors and paused, listening. Silence. The electronic lock on this door was far more complex. He had no hope of bypassing it mechanically. But as he examined it in the dim light, he saw a small, almost invisible panel below. A manual override for emergencies. It would require a key, of course, but the panel itself was slightly ajar, a tiny flaw in an otherwise perfect system. Prying it open with the pen clip, he saw a cluster of wires. It was a long shot, a desperate hope, but his work involved understanding complex circuits. He saw the two wires leading to the magnetic lock. Taking a deep, steadying breath, he crossed them. A tiny spark, a faint ZZZT, and the lock disengaged with a muted thud. He was in. The office was cast in shadows, the only light a cold, blue-gray glow from the massive window, which offered a rain-streaked, panoramic view of the storm-lashed city. The air was thick with the scent of Ryan, sandalwood, leather, and that unique, potent alpha musk that made Arthur's nerves stand on end. He went to the computer first. As expected, the security was military-grade. He could spend a week trying to hack it and get nowhere. He abandoned it and moved to the desk. He was searching for leverage, financial documents, lists of contacts, evidence of illegal activities he could use as a bargaining chip. His fingers moved quickly and silently through the drawers, finding nothing but neatly organized, legitimate business files. Then he found it, a single drawer in the mahogany desk that was locked. It was an old-fashioned lock, a stark contrast to the high-tech security elsewhere. It was a place for personal secrets. After a minute of tense, focused work with his makeshift tool, he felt the telltale click. He slid the drawer open. Inside, there was only a single, slim manila folder. No label. His pulse quickened. This had to be it. He lifted the folder, his hands trembling slightly, and opened it on the desk. It wasn't what he expected. There were no financial statements, no incriminating photographs. It was a collection of medical documents. He frowned in confusion, his eyes scanning the top page. It was a lab report from a private clinic. He saw complex terminology, lists of hormones and cell counts that meant little to him. But one line, a clinical abbreviation, stood out, HCG. He knew that one. It was the pregnancy hormone. He thought it must be a report for some woman Ryan was involved with. But then his eyes fell on the patient name printed in stark, black letters at the top of the page. Patient, Ryan Cross. The world tilted on its axis. Arthur stared at the name, his brain refusing to process the information. It was a mistake. A typo. It had to be. He frantically flipped to the next page, an ultrasound report. Again, the same name. And beneath it, a grainy, black and white image of a tiny, nascent shape, and clinical notations, gestational age, 9 weeks. Fetal heartbeat, 172 BPM. The pieces of the puzzle, all the disparate data points he had been collecting, slammed into place with the force of a physical blow. The exhaustion he had mistaken for arrogance. The strange, protective possessiveness. The flashes of pain. The hand on the stomach. The trembling. The raw, primal fear he had seen in the alpha's eyes. Ryan Cross, the most powerful and dangerous alpha in the city, the man who had kidnapped him and held him prisoner, was pregnant. And the timing, 9 weeks. Arthur did the math, his blood running cold. The night at the club. A gasp escaped his lips, a small, wounded sound in the silent room. He staggered back, the papers slipping from his numb fingers and scattering across the polished floor. He felt a dizzying, terrifying wave of vertigo, his hand reaching out to the desk to steady himself. This was impossible. It defied biology, nature, logic. And yet, the proof was right there, lying at his feet. I was wondering how long it would take your curious little mind to lead you here. Arthur froze, his heart stopping in his chest. Ryan was standing in the doorway, a dark silhouette against the dimly lit hall. He hadn't heard him approach. He was holding a glass of water, his expression unreadable in the shadows. He looked from Arthur's pale, shocked face to the medical reports scattered on the floor. His eyes, even in the darkness, seemed to glitter with a cold, devastating resignation. The fight was over. The secret was out. Ryan closed the door and flicked on a low-wattage lamp on his desk, bathing the scene in a soft, merciless glow. He looked terrible. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his face was drawn and pale, the picture of a man stretched to his breaking point. "You know," Ryan said, his voice quiet, devoid of its usual power. It was just tired. Arthur couldn't find his voice. He could only nod, his eyes wide with a million unasked questions. Ryan's laugh was a dry, broken sound. He set the glass down and sank into one of the leather armchairs, the movement stiff and weary. "Congratulations, Arthur. You found the king's weakness." He ran a hand over his face, a gesture of profound exhaustion. The mask was gone. In its place was just a man, trapped and terrified. The storm outside raged on, a mirror to the tempest that had finally broken inside the office. The silence that fell between them was no longer hostile, but heavy with the weight of their impossible reality. It was a silence filled with the soft sounds of Ryan's ragged breathing and the gentle clink of the water glass as Arthur held it steady. The roles had been irrevocably reversed. The captor was now the patient, the captive, the reluctant caretaker. Ryan drank the water, his throat working, his golden eyes never leaving Arthur's face. The gaze was stripped of its arrogance and authority. What remained was a raw, unnerving vulnerability, a silent plea that Arthur couldn't decipher but felt in the marrow of his bones. He was looking at Arthur not as a conquest or an asset, but as the sole witness to his complete undoing. Arthur slowly rose from his kneeling position, the cold reality of the situation beginning to seep past his shock. He was still a prisoner. This man was still his kidnapper. But the context had shifted into a dimension he could never have imagined. His logical mind, the part of him that organized code and solved complex problems, struggled to categorize this. It was a bug in the system of the world, a fatal error in the source code of nature. "You need to see your doctor," Arthur said, his voice flat and clinical. It was the only way he could function, by treating this as a problem, a crisis to be managed. Ryan shook his head, a faint, bitter smile touching his lips. "Alistair can't fix this. He can only document my downfall." "You're sick," Arthur insisted, his eyes flicking to Ryan's pale face. "The pain, the nausea, that's not normal. You need proper care, not whatever this is." He gestured around the gilded cage of the office. "Nothing about this is normal," Ryan countered, his voice regaining a sliver of its strength. He pushed himself more upright in the chair, the effort costing him. "And care is the last thing I can afford. Care looks like weakness. And weakness gets you killed." He finally tore his gaze from Arthur and stared out at the rain-lashed city. "My rivals, the Moetti family, are circling like vultures. They sense something is wrong. My own people are starting to whisper. If they knew the truth, if they knew their fearsome leader was, he couldn't say the word. They would tear me apart and feed my corpse to the dogs." The brutal honesty of his words hung in the air. Arthur understood, intellectually, the violent, precarious world Ryan inhabited. He had read the news stories, heard the gossip. But to hear it laid bare, to understand that this impossible pregnancy was not just a medical crisis but a death sentence, shifted something inside him. His anger was still there, a hot coal in his chest, but it was now complicated by a chilling, reluctant empathy. "So what's your plan?" Arthur asked, crossing his arms. It wasn't a question of forgiveness, it was a question of survival. And whether he liked it or not, their survival was now inexplicably linked. Are you just going to hide in this mansion until the baby comes, hoping no one notices? I had a plan, Ryan admitted, his voice low. I was going to find you. Control you. Keep you here until I could figure out what to do, how to manage this without anyone knowing. You were the one variable I couldn't account for. The source of the problem. I thought if I had you, I could control the outcome. You thought you could lock away your problem in a spare bedroom. Arthur's voice was laced with a cold, sharp irony. I'm not a piece of code you can quarantine, Ryan. I'm a person. I know that now, Ryan said, and the quiet sincerity in his voice was more disarming than any threat. He looked back at Arthur, his expression etched with a deep, weary regret. I handled this wrong. I was driven by fear. In my world, fear is a motivator for control. It's all I've ever known. Arthur stared at him, the man who had terrified him, who had stolen his freedom. He saw the king, the tyrant, the alpha. But now, he also saw a man backed into a corner by his own biology, terrified and utterly alone. His own fear and anger had been a shield, but now, faced with Ryan's raw vulnerability, he felt that shield begin to lower. He was still a prisoner, but the bars of his cage had become hazy, uncertain. He walked over and began gathering the medical reports from the floor, his movements precise and methodical. He stacked them neatly and placed them back in the folder, closing it with a sense of finality. He was putting the impossible truth away, at least for a moment. This changes nothing, Arthur said, his back to Ryan. I still want to go home. I still want my life back. I know, Ryan replied softly. But you see now why I can't let you go. You're the only other person on Earth who knows. If you walk out that door, you walk out with the secret that could destroy me. I can't risk that. Arthur turned to face him, the folder held tightly in his hand. So I'm your prisoner forever? Is that it? Your secret keeper in a gilded cage? No, Ryan said, pushing himself to his feet. He swayed for a moment, but found his balance. He was still weak, but the iron will that had built his empire was beginning to reassert itself. Not a prisoner. Not anymore. He took a step toward Arthur, his movements slow, deliberate. He stopped a few feet away, creating a space of mutual respect that hadn't existed between them before. I'm asking for your help, Arthur, he said, and the words, coming from him, were more shocking than the medical reports had been. I am in over my head. I'm losing control of my body, and I'm losing control of my organization. I need someone I can trust. And as insane as it sounds, the only person on this planet I can trust right now is you. You have no loyalty to my enemies. And you have a stake in this, whether you want to or not. Arthur's heart pounded. Help him? Help the man who had kidnapped him? The idea was ludicrous. It was a betrayal of every principle he held. But as he looked at Ryan, he saw the terrifying logic in his request. He was trapped, and his only way out might be to go deeper in. If Ryan's empire fell, what would happen to the man who held its biggest secret? The Moetti family wouldn't leave loose ends. A fragile, unspoken truce began to form in the space between them. It was not born of forgiveness or affection, but of pure, unadulterated necessity. A symbiotic contract between two enemies bound by a shared, impossible fate. Arthur was a strategist, a man who saw patterns and calculated risks. The biggest risk, he was starting to realize, wasn't staying. It was leaving. What do you want from me? Arthur asked, his voice barely a whisper. A wave of relief, so profound it was almost imperceptible, washed over Ryan's features. For now, he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. I just want you to stay. Not as my prisoner, but as my ally. The word hung in the air, foreign and unbelievable. Arthur looked from the folder in his hands to the defeated king before him. His cage had just transformed. The bars were gone, but the walls were now the size of the city, the lock a secret that could get them both killed. He was no longer just a captive. He was a co-conspirator. The storm had passed. In the east, the first, faint hint of dawn was beginning to paint the sky in shades of gray and violet. A new day was beginning, one that bore no resemblance to the world they had known before. And that is the end of part 1 of the Alpha's secret. The lines have been drawn, the secret has been revealed, and an impossible alliance has been forged in the heart of the storm. What will happen now that Arthur is no longer a prisoner, but a partner in the underworld's most dangerous secret? How will they navigate the treacherous waters of the Mafia as rivals close in and Ryan's condition becomes harder to hide? The story is only just beginning. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want to find out what happens next, please make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you won't miss the premiere of Part 2. Your support means the world and allows us to keep bringing you these stories. We'll see you next time.